If you were trying to walk through the orchards of Sunnyvale in the 1950s, you could have walked for miles. Greetings from Sunnyvale, California. Sunnyvale, a small city with a big history. A city with a rich agricultural and industrial past, made even richer by the advances of science and technology. But Sunnyvale did not become the city that it is today by accident. There were people, companies, and events that changed the course of the city's history. We'd like to take you on a short journey that will introduce you to the people, places, and events that created and then molded the city of Sunnyvale. Sunnyvale is a modern, high-technology city. It's hard to imagine the city as it was 100 years ago. But there are many opportunities to learn about the city's past. You can get a feel for some of the city's history by walking through an orchard. You could take Deborah Olson's guided tour through some of the last remaining cherry orchards in the city.
Cherries to Martha Stewart's of the world and kind of Julia Child. You put some more water in here just in case it gets really hot here in another week or so.
These tours serve to remind us of a simpler past, a time when things moved more slowly, when almost everyone in the city knew everyone else, and when growing and picking fruit was big business. These few acres, along with a few more, are all that remains of Sunnyvale's rich agricultural past. You might be left with the impression that there is not much remaining from Sunnyvale's history. But if you take the time to slow down and look closely, you will be surprised. Not far from the tour is Orchard Heritage Park, where you'll find an interpretive exhibit showing how the people of Sunnyvale lived and how they farmed this land. Next door is Sunnyvale's Heritage Park Museum, where you can view exhibits and artifacts depicting our early pioneers and the city's agricultural and manufacturing past. And if you know where to look, you can learn quite a bit about Sunnyvale's history just by driving down the street. If you happen to find yourself on Matilda, sooner or later you would drive past the former home of the Zarko family. The Zarko home looks pretty much the way it did in the 1950s. Here are Pete and Ann Zarko with their son David. When Pete wasn't working at his garage, he liked to shoot a roll or two of film, or, in this case, have one of his friends operate the camera for him. Luckily for us, Pete Zarko shot a lot of film. One day, Pete Zarko went to the top of a tower in Sunnyvale and captured the way the city looked in the early 1950s. We know that Pete Zarko shot this film. That's his foot in the bottom of the picture. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. How much history can you really see when you walk or drive around our modern city? To help you find the history, we'll go back in time about 100 years where it all began. This was the home of Martin Murphy Jr. and Mary Murphy, quite possibly the most important family in Sunnyvale's early history. The home was called the Bay View, since in those days it had an unobstructed view of the bay. The Murphy family came to California as part of the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy Party, which crossed the Sierra Nevada before the ill-fated Donner Party. Settling first in Sacramento, the Murphy family later moved to the area of Santa Clara Valley known as Rancho Pastoria de las Borregas, which is what Sunnyvale was then called, to avoid the greed and lawlessness of the gold rush and to be closer to Murphy's father and brothers, who also lived in the Santa Clara Valley. This is Murphy Park today, the former site of the Murphy home. The home is long gone now, but Sunnyvale's modern story begins here. In 1861, Martin Murphy Jr. allowed the San Francisco and San Jose Railroad to build a rail line directly through his property. In those times, it was possible for a single rancher to own as much as 8,000 or 9,000 acres of land. By the 1870s, a new county property tax sped the breakup of the large family-owned ranches, forcing ranchers to sell off their property in smaller parcels. One of the locals who would benefit from the breakup of the large ranches was San Jose realtor Walter Crossman, who bought 200 acres from the Murphy family. Crossman, who was quite enterprising and had plans to create a city of destiny, took out an ad in area newspapers offering a free train ride to Sunnyvale. He wanted people to see what a great city it was for agriculture, business, or for raising a family. And people took notice. Many Bay Area residents took the offer and rode the free train to look at the land, including Hannah and Carl Olson, who quickly determined that the area was perfect for growing and selling cherries and other crops. At the time, most residents still called the town Encinal, which meant where the live oak grows. Crossman tried to rename the town Murphy. When it was discovered that both Encinal and Murphy were already taken by other California cities, residents agreed on the more generic name of Sunnyvale. Sunny for the great weather, and Vale, which means wide river valley. Crossman's promotion of the city and his free train rides attracted many new businesses to Sunnyvale. The Jubilee Incubator Company was one of the first and one of the most famous. They manufactured incubators for eggs, and it was said at the time that a Jubilee trademark on poultry equipment was the same as sterling on silver. Cheap land, abundant water, low labor costs, and easy access to San Francisco were enough to entice the owners of Jubilee to move from Oakland to Sunnyvale in 1907. With a workforce of over 300, they set up shop at the southeast corner of Evelyn and Sunnyvale Avenues, near the Southern Pacific Railroad tracks. The company failed during the Great Depression, and this piece of our history survives only in photographs and artifacts on display at the Historical Museum. Occasionally, a failed factory will get a second chance. The Bowser Corporation took over the Jubilee building in the 1950s. With the original building long since gone, the site is now a condominium complex. In Sunnyvale, change is nonstop. Many long-term residents will tell you that they barely recognize the city at all. They remember it as a little town.
When I first started at 42, there was approximately 3,200 people. And it always grew in the summer because we had the transients that came in to cut the fruit and work the canneries. And they had a general delivery window. And I knew all the people that came there. And you knew everyone because it was so small, you know. And when I left, there were over 300 people working the post office. And that was a lot of people. When I retired in 1980, I believe the population of Sunnyvale was approximately over 100,000 people.
My folks, after they were here in Sunnyvale a couple of years, wanted to go back into business because that's what they were in business in Michigan. So they opened a store in the middle of the block of Murphy. They rented. It was right next to the theater. Folks knew there'd be a demand for work clothing because that's all they worked in the cannery. They saw what the ladies there needed work clothing. So they would go to San Francisco, buy the clothing, bring it to Sunnyvale, put it in the store and sell it. And they're successful right off the bat.
To come to a little town of around 3,000 people, that was quite a culture shock. And to walk down the street with my little brother that was 9 years old, we used to go to Murphy Street, which was the heart of Sunnyvale, and say hello to everybody that we went by. My brother would say, "Do you know them?" I say, "No, I don't know them, but you say hello to everybody because we're new here."
I've always loved Sunnyvale because, to me, it's still like a small town, even though it has, what, 100 and, I don't know how many, 100,000, over 100,000 people. But it's still like a small town to me, and I remember it the way it used to be.
I live on Roosevelt Avenue. That's where I was born, and I still live there, which is very unusual that people tell me that. Also, growing up in Sunnyvale was so different at that time. There was a lot of open fields, empty lots, and we used to play football. Yeah, I played football and baseball, marbles, and then in the summertime we would play at night, you know, like kick the can and stuff like that. There was a lot of room for us to grow up in.
I came to Sunnyvale as a new bride, 18 years old. Yeah, my husband was working at the Shuckles Cannery at the time. Got 50 cents an hour, and that was considered enough to get married on.
Naturally, businesses that supported the agricultural industry began to set up shop in Sunnyvale. The Woolridge Manufacturing Company produced heavy farming equipment such as scrapers and rototillers. Another manufacturer who was lured to Sunnyvale with the promise of some very favorable land terms was the Joshua Hendy Iron Works. The Hendy plant relocated from San Francisco to Sunnyvale after losing their original plant in the 1906 earthquake. The Hendy plant would later play a major role in Sunnyvale history, beginning with World War II. In 1929, a young real estate agent from Niles, Laura Whipple, heard that the Navy was looking for a site in California to build a strategic air base. She then visited a piece of land located between Sunnyvale and Mountain View. At that time, the land was used to raise broccoli, cauliflower, and hay. When asked what she saw when she visited the ranch, she answered simply, "An air base." She went to work gathering support from the local communities and soon all of the Bay Area cities were raising money to buy the land. Still, the Navy had not made up its mind. San Diego's Camp Kearney was a serious contender for the base, but Laura Whipple wanted it here. Undaunted, she worked with the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce to produce a film that would help convince both the public and the Navy that this was the ideal strategic location from which to launch massive airships to patrol the Pacific coast. Airships, or dirigibles, were rapidly gaining popularity as a valuable military transport and for tactical scouting over the Pacific Ocean. On May 23, 1930, this locally produced film was shown to the public at the Strand Theater on Murphy Avenue. The Strand became the Palace, then the Town and Country, and finally is now a nightclub. We're now able to see this historic film for the first time since the 1930s. In 1930, traveling by air was a relatively rare treat, so local residents were amazed to see what their communities looked like when viewed from above. A cameraman must have roamed the streets of Sunnyvale looking for shots to use that would help promote Sunnyvale to the government. These fine Sunnyvale homes, some still standing today, were presented in the film as being typical for the town. The planning and promotion for the new Navy base, or airport as some called it, continued. But this new Navy airport wouldn't be Sunnyvale's first port. It was built right on top of another. You can still see the remains of the 2-mile-long dredged shipping channel that was the South Shore Port, which opened with high hopes in 1920, but closed in bankruptcy by 1927. There are no visible remains of the turning basin or the docks or the warehouses that were part of the South Shore Port. This first port was eventually forgotten by local residents, and without any physical evidence of its location, it's hard to imagine fruits and other local produce being shipped from Sunnyvale to San Francisco and points north. The best way to see where the port was located is by looking at an old aerial photograph of Moffett Field. This photograph shows the recently completed hangars 2 and 3. The port and its structures were visible up to the mid-40s, as you can see in this photograph taken in 1943. The old port was captured for posterity by accident. If you were to overlay a modern image of the same location, you would see that the extension of the runways after World War II covered the turning basin and the port warehouse. The competition between San Diego and Sunnyvale for the new naval air base was fierce. San Diego newspapers claimed that the Bay Area was too foggy to fly dirigibles, and San Francisco newspapers commented on the volume of air traffic and the many angles of attack that made San Diego vulnerable. Finally, a decision was made and President Herbert Hoover signed the bill allowing the Navy to take ownership of the property for $1 and to appropriate $5 million to build the base and the giant hangar. At the same time that the base was under construction in Sunnyvale, the Navy was busy in Akron, Ohio, building the first of the 2 largest U.S. airships ever created. The eventual arrival of those airships at the new base served to reinforce Walter Crossman's dream of Sunnyvale as the city of destiny. While the new air station was under construction, Sunnyvale was greeted by the first of the 2 giant airships, the USS Akron. This was the sister ship of the soon-to-be-completed USS Macon, which would be stationed in Sunnyvale. You can see the massive Hangar 1, which would eventually cover 8 acres of ground, being built to hold the colossal airship. The big day finally arrived May 13th, 1932, when the Akron would come to visit Sunnyvale's new air base. It was such an event that thousands would line a 2-lane dirt road that we now call the Bayshore Freeway just to watch. Local officials and law enforcement braced for what the San Jose Mercury News called the biggest traffic problem in state history. Over 100,000 people came from all over the Bay Area to see the arrival of the new dirigible. It was a spectacular day in Sunnyvale history, but sadly, the history of the Akron was not long. On April 4th, 1933, the Akron went down off the New Jersey coast, taking with it 73 men, including Admiral William Moffett. The very next month, the landing field in Sunnyvale was renamed Moffett Field in his honor. Naval Air Station Sunnyvale was officially commissioned on April 12, 1933, but the festivities were overshadowed by the recent tragedy. On October 16th, that same year, residents celebrated the arrival of the newly completed Macon. The USS Macon would become the largest moving object made by man, measuring over 785 feet.
Of the world's largest airship. How those sea heroes of the past would marvel could they see this sight. The twin sciences of the 20th century, aviation and radio, collaborating to bring into your home a vivid account of this newest wonder of the world. The first radio broadcast from the largest airship on Earth.
The Macon never failed to draw a crowd, and it was said that everyone in the county would stop what they were doing to watch the massive airship float by. The Macon called Hangar 1 its home for the next 18 months, running tests and performing scouting missions with the Pacific Fleet until February of 1935, when it encountered a storm off Point Sur, California. The dirigible sank in deep water, effectively ending the Navy's controversial program of rigid airships. But airships still fly over Sunnyvale today. The airship Eureka, a passenger-only airship, takes regular flights over the city, leaving from Moffett Field. The Eureka, though seemingly large, is only 1/4 the size of the giant Macon that floated over Sunnyvale in the early 1930s. With the loss of the Macon and the end of the Zeppelin era, the newly renamed Moffett Field would find other roles for our nation in the not-so-distant future.
Sunnyvale before the war was still a small town. Everybody knew everybody. We used to shop at all the popular stores like Kirkish and Frank Experry Hardware, and the post office was in town too.
The country was still recovering from the Great Depression. The year was 1938, and FDR declared May 15th National Airmail Week in an effort to promote air travel in the United States. Sunnyvale was always willing to put on a show of it. Here, a ceremonial bag of mail was flown out of Moffett Field to San Francisco. The mail came back just a few hours later. It was the latest in modern communications. This giant leap forward in the mail service was memorialized in film and photographs. You'll notice that the photographer accidentally gets in the camera's frame. That day, everyone got their shot. Not to be outdone, the volunteer fire department took this photo, showing off the progression of their modernization. Though no one can remember where the top half was moved to, the bottom half was left in place and was a part of this commercial structure. After the Depression, but before World War II, Sunnyvale did what it did best: grew produce, packed, canned, and shipped it. Still a small community with a quaint downtown, it was like a Norman Rockwell painting.
I was born in Honolulu, Hawaii, and came to Sunnyvale when I was about 3 years old. My parents came to work at Libby's and Shuckles and the canneries, and grew up here in Sunnyvale and came to Fremont, which unfortunately I didn't get to graduate. I came 3 years to Fremont. The war broke out and I had to go work in the canneries with the folks.
My name is Frank Garcia, born in Sunnyvale in 1923, and lived till high school time, even went to school here. And then, of course, when the war broke out, why, things changed a bit. And Uncle Sam needed me real bad. So he had given me a personal invitation.
By the end of the 1930s, Sunnyvale had already begun to support the war effort. In addition to an Army air base, Sunnyvale's two major canneries, Libby's and Shuckles, were both heavily involved in supporting the war effort. The Hendy Iron Works, a world leader in mining technology before the war, developed giant hydraulic crushers that were used to help build the Panama Canal. Hendy did what it could to stay afloat during the Depression years, They adapted their engineering skills to develop giant gates and valves used in the Hoover Dam and other large structures. They even created standards for streetlights, some of which can still be seen in San Francisco's Chinatown. Many of our local farmers saw the writing on the wall and began moonlighting at the ironworks. But the produce and canning industry continued on. At Shuckles Cannery, young workers mugged for the camera in the summer of 1939. 2 months after this cheery footage was shot, Germany invaded Poland, and the clouds of war began to form over Sunnyvale. A little more than a year later, these workers would gather around a radio to hear the president speak.
Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate and of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by
Now the nation had a purpose. Every city, community, and factory was involved in production for the war effort, and the Iron Men of Hendy were going to lead the way. By the 1930s, the Hendy Company was in severe financial distress and had shrunk to only 60 employees. But the government contracts would be the company's salvation. The Navy needed ships, and the Hendy Iron Works built the engines. Lots of engines. Lots of really big engines. The first big contract was to build 118 triple expansion steam engines for the Liberty ships. By the time the war was over, they had built a record 754 reciprocating engines in 3.5 years, which powered 28% of the Liberty ships used in the war, more than any other single plant in the country. In a tribute to the plant, the Navy even named a Liberty ship the Joshua Hendy. The number of employees grew based on these contracts, eventually reaching a peak of 11,500 workers. But where would Hendy house all of these new workers? Wood and other natural resources were scarce, and communities weren't allowed to build new homes during the war. But Sunnyvale was different. It was a strategic city, and that meant that housing only could be built to help house the influx of new workers. This housing development, built right next to the plant, became known as Victory Village. Records indicate that this was one of only 3 new housing developments built in town during the war years. All the industries in town were producing for the war effort, and the Moffett base became the center of West Coast surveillance operations. With Moffett Field's air power and the Hendy Iron Works creating engines for the Navy, Sunnyvale was making a huge contribution to the war effort. Hangars 2 and 3 were built during the war out of wood and concrete, as there was a shortage of steel. They remain 2 of the largest freestanding wooden structures in the world. Throughout the war, the Hendy Iron Works held bond rallies, helping to raise money for the war effort. In 1943, Harry Truman, then a congressman from Washington and soon to be our next president, came to see the factory for himself. Plant manager Charles Moore gave the congressman a personal tour of the massive plant. By 1944, this man would take over the president's office from Franklin Roosevelt, leading our country during the largest war in history. By 1945, this man would make the decision that would end the war.
The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base. We won the race of discovery against the Germans. We have used it in order to shorten the agony of war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans.
Within a few days of the ending of the war in the Pacific, government contracts ended and almost 9,000 workers were without a job. As the memory of the war slowly started to fade, Sunnyvale began its transformation from a sleepy small town to a city. By 1954, there were 29 housing developments under construction in the city, which would add another 4,000 homes. This transformation is still happening today. In the 1950s, Sunnyvale grew from 6 square miles to just over 13 square miles. This expansion was accomplished through annexation, which is a complex and sometimes controversial method by which a city can acquire land directly adjacent to its city limits, or sometimes land that's already within its city limits. Some areas of Sunnyvale did not resist annexation. They looked forward to receiving all of the city services that would accompany becoming a part of the city of Sunnyvale. But there were a few pockets of land that stood firm and resisted. Even today, those areas remain separate from the city. One such island is located right in the heart of the city, the Butcher Ranch.
Well, when I married Bob, we lived first in a little house over across the driveway, and then we built this house right away. It was orchards. A few strawberry fields. And it was that way for years. I could go into San Jose driving through orchards, and then pretty soon I was driving through subdivisions.
So I was born here, grew up on this land, and the things I really liked to do particularly were play in the dirt. Play in the dirt, climb the trees, just be out with the plants, and we didn't really have animals. There were dogs, but they didn't stick around long. And the water. I loved the irrigation ditch. That was a great place to play. It's probably during those early 60s when we saw so much growth on Fremont Road, which was where I was going back and forth to high school. And you know, you come here and it would be what people say now is like an oasis. you can forget that you're surrounded by so many houses and so many cars and people.
The Butcher Ranch remains an island today, still located in the heart of Sunnyvale. There were other types of islands as well, homes that stood apart from the rest due to their unique design, such as the strange flat-top roofs of homes in some neighborhoods. These homes, quite unusual in their day, were built by Eichler Homes and became known simply as Eichlers. The uniqueness of these neighborhoods is much more visible from above.
I liked the fact that it all was usable space. We looked around and my husband said, that's the house style I want, and so he had chosen this one. And so we put $100 down to reserve our house. Well, I liked the atrium. Eichlers were not painted, they were stained. And ours was a dark stain. And if you know anything about heat and flat-roofed houses.
Between 1950 and 1974, Joseph Eichler's company built over 11,000 homes like these in 12 communities in California. Sunnyvale was one such community, eventually becoming the home to over 1,500 Eichlers. Around the same time that Daniel Rodriguez was celebrating his 11th birthday, another island was being built in Sunnyvale. It wasn't an island that you could visit. It was an island of secrecy. Just as the Cold War was gearing up, the government started building something on the north end of town. Officially, it was called the Sunnyvale Air Force Base. But the locals called it the Blue Cube. The Blue Cube was a tracking station for military satellites. For a period of time, the Blue Cube was Silicon Valley's most likely target of attack by Soviet nuclear missiles. The people who worked here were told not to wear their uniforms around town and not to talk about what they did there. Built in 1960 on land near Moffett Field purchased from Lockheed, the station was originally known as the Air Force Satellite Test Center. In 1994, the base was renamed Onizuka Air Force Base in honor of Lieutenant Colonel Ellison Onizuka, one of the astronauts who died in the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster on January 26, 1986. The Cube's next mission has yet to be announced.
A very exuberant Chamber of Commerce man, Al Spires, and the census of 1950, he was determined that we get a count of 10,000, because if you have 10,000 people, you get on the map. And after he got up above 9,000, he was going to, they claimed, to the motels and even knocking on doors trying to get it up to 10,000, and he couldn't do it, and we didn't get that. But he was whispering to us that you haven't seen anything yet. Your Sunnyvale is going to grow. Apparently, he knew they were dickering with Lockheed. We didn't know it at the time, but right after that, about 52 or 3, somewhere in there, Lockheed showed up. And after that, boy, there was no stopping Sunnyvale.
High technology was following government and military needs with Moffett Field and NASA, and now Lockheed in town. Lockheed planned their move to Sunnyvale from Southern California so that their workers would leave work in Van Nuys on Friday, drive up to Sunnyvale over the weekend, and be at their same desk on Monday morning. It all went perfectly. Now the city was expanding all of its industrial areas. New office parks were springing up all over the northern part of town. The southern end of town was changing too. As Sunnyvale grew to the south, El Camino was realigned, eliminating access to Old San Francisco Road and creating a parking lot in front of the old Greyhound station and Sunnyvale Hardware. This was the beginning of the end of Murphy Avenue as the primary entrance to downtown. Newly widened Matilda and Sunnyvale Avenue were now the main way into downtown. If you could lay this image over the same spot in modern Sunnyvale, you'll notice how much wider El Camino is today, and you'll also notice that Murphy Avenue is almost completely lost on today's map of Sunnyvale. But not lost is the building that used to be the Junction Creamery. It had served as the Greyhound bus station for many years. Since the 50s, this building had been many things. In the 70s, it was a bar that would change the entertainment industry forever.
It was an odd game because it required two people to play, and that's not a common thing to do. Part of the reason for its success was that it was a quarter play. And there weren't many machines at that point. Pinball machines were 10-cent play. Nolan and Ted Dabney had money left over from the computer space, and they used that to buy pinball machines and other coin-operated amusement machines, and they ran them in the local area around Sunnyvale at various establishments. When it came time to try it out, we had this Andy Capp's Tavern was our favorite location. We knew the owner, it was a fun place, and we could trust him, and so we chose Andy Capp's Tavern to try out this funny machine with no instructions whatsoever. The day we installed the bong machine, bought a beer, and sat back and watched and see if anybody played it, because I was kind of astonished as how could anybody proceed to play a machine that they never saw before. All it said was Pong and two knobs, and people did indeed.
And so the video game industry had its coming out party right on the El Camino Real at Murphy Avenue. It was once a soda fountain and a bus station, then a bar, and today it's Rooster T. Feathers Comedy Club.
Well, I think Sunnyvale was right at the center of what is now called Silicon Valley, that you had at that time in the 70s, you had a young generation just coming out of college that was very smart. You know, maybe it's in the water, I don't know, but a lot of things started around that time, and a lot of things that changed society happened here. You had in the summer, this time of year, you had the smell from the fruit cocktail canning going on, the canning. There were orchards all over the place, so you drive to these various new companies like Intel and Fairchild, you know, between the orchards. There are hardly any of those left anymore. There was a lot of activity and a lot of excitement and interest about these new things called microprocessors coming around. What could you do with them? And the world seemed very open, a lot of opportunity, a lot of possibility.
We bought the building on Murphy Avenue from the Sunnyvale Bakery, and that's where he stayed until he retired. And he had a lot of friends that would come to see him. Even the policeman from the Sunnyvale department used to go over there for coffee and donuts. So he knew everybody. But there was a big change, and my husband was very sad when they knocked down all the buildings, and what really was sad was the City Hall. It was such a beautiful building. It was white stucco with red tile, with a clock in the front and a tower. It was so pretty.
How do you pass down a memory when that place is no longer there? Especially when your city changes so quickly.
Something happened that was very rare in Sunnyvale. We had a cyclone, and I think it was in '51, but I'm not sure. And it took part of, it went through Westinghouse, and my brother's garage, the doors were taken by the cyclone. He never found them again. They just went. It's the first time we ever experienced anything like that. A lot of homes in Sunnyvale, the older homes, they had damage. Fireplaces, you know, they were old houses, it's crumbled. It was quite a shock to us. My years at Fremont were terrific. Nothing but good. It was just great.
I know I walk down the street now in the main town of Sunnyvale, Murphy Avenue, and I will look and I'll say, oh, this store was here, and that store was here. Now it's different, you know.
Well, yeah, over the years I've seen a lot of changes in Sunnyvale, particularly when the downtown was built, you know, the mall. I think that's what we still call it. And then the destruction of it, and hopefully the rebuilding of it one of these days.
It was a wonderful little city. All orchards from Pastoria on, and across the tracks, I believe it was Maud Avenue. From then on, it was all orchards. Sunnyvale Avenue was all orchards. And then El Camino Real, this way to the high school, was all orchards. And at this time of the year, during Easter, it was absolutely lovely. For a young girl to see all these trees in bloom, it was out of this world.
People say, well, it's not a big town now either, but in my standards it is. But if you had been living here when it was a small town, you'd know what I meant. It just isn't the same.
This was a new idea of joining your police and fire department so that it would save money. The firemen sit around a lot between fires. So it was a very, very difficult fight.
This looks like any other condominium complex, but it was once the headquarters of the Shuckles Cannery. It's an award-winning design that was once thought to be the future of commercial office buildings. And though it's gone now, we have these photos and films to remind us that it was once there. But what if something wasn't around long enough to find a place in our hearts and memories? Like the South Shore Port, local history can be lost when the whole world is changing around you. And just because no one thought it was important enough to take a picture of it, doesn't mean that it didn't exist. Clara King opened the Kingsport Plunge right next door to the South Shore Port. It was the largest saltwater pool in Santa Clara County. Opened on Memorial Day 1925, just as she promised, over 5,000 people showed up for the grand opening weekend. It's King's Sport at Kingsport. That was the slogan that year, with diving shows, a beauty contest, and of course, a concert by the Sunnyvale Brass Band. The port went bankrupt in 1927, followed by the stock market crash of '29, the Dust Bowl of the early '30s, the Great Depression, and World War II. With all of these major events, it's no wonder that no one remembers the Kingsport Plunge. The next time you look at an old photograph of the Macon arriving in Sunnyvale, look into the distance. You'll see something long forgotten. After World War II, the building was gone, but the remains of the pool were still there. Which makes this film all the more poignant. The Murphy House, brought here by sea in pieces from Maine around the Horn of South America. It was the first wooden frame home in Santa Clara County. Memories can be passed down in many different ways. One way is through photos and films. It's a great way to show our children or grandchildren the city, the way we remembered it. And someday, they'll hopefully do the same. Here in Murphy Park is where our story ends. But Sunnyvale's story, as the city of destiny, continues.